Well, it's a huge pleasure and a privilege to be here this evening. I'm almost overwhelmed with embarrassment, but also gratitude to be mentioned in the same breath as Henry Kissinger by Senator McCain. My role tonight, I want to make it clear to you, ladies and gentlemen, is not to be some kind of latter-day David Frost, despite what you may infer from my accent. We are, as Senator McCain rightly said, both in our ways historians, but when it comes to experience of making history, I am a nothing compared with the man sitting on my right. And what I propose to do, and I think we have around half an hour in which to do it, is to ask some historically informed questions about the predicament of the United States today. I want to begin by asking you about Afghanistan. Many people, I'm sure, will have read your recent piece in Newsweek on the subject. Can we begin by putting it in historical perspective? Because many people jump to the conclusion that this is President Obama's Vietnam. Do you see that as a helpful historical analogy?
Before I answer the question, might I thank Senator McCain and Larry Eagleburger for what they've said here. I think the task of a leader is to take the society from where it is to where it hasn't been. And that takes, above all, moral courage, because that is a lonely road. And I know no national leader who has exemplified this more consistently and more courageously than Senator McCain. And that is why his friendship has those of you who have read about me in various books and articles know how abused and terrorized and mistreated my staff was. And you saw a classic example of this in Larry Eagleburger, who 40 years after he worked for me directly, is still telling stories about our common adventures, which improve with age, like good wine. But I want to pay tribute to people like Larry and Brent Scowcroft and others with whom I had the privilege to be associated in a very complicated period in which we were trying to preserve the honor of America by not abandoning people who had relied on us, and at the same time try to create a structure of peace. And we could do it because we shared a sense of commitment and a sense of adventure, and because they were forgiving enough to put up with my idiosyncrasies. So I want to thank Larry and Brent, who did me the honor of coming here, and all the others that shared this experience with me. Now to get to your question. Is it another Vietnam? First of all, I have a perception of Vietnam which is not the majority media perception of Vietnam. I think, in essence, we defeated ourselves. Vietnam was a problem of the American soul and not of the American performance. And until we accept this, we are not going to learn the lessons of that period. We entered a war with decent motives and attempted to pursue it by judgments that turned out to be not applicable to the situation because they were drawn from a European experience. And when I say we, I mean the Kennedy and Johnson administration. President Nixon attempted to disengage us from that war. And while he is accused today of having prolonged the war, the only decision he made that prolonged the war was his refusal of the communist demand that at the beginning of the peacemaking process, we had to replace the government of Vietnam with a communist-dominated government, and after which we would have to withdraw our troops under fire. Those two conditions he refused, and if that is prolonging the war, we would do it again. So I say that because that is also, we have to ask ourselves about Afghanistan. We have to ask, where are we? And where are we trying to go? And where we are is in a country that it's located between major power centers in the world, which is one of the reasons why it has maintained its independence. It is located between Russia, now India and Pakistan, then the British Empire, China, Iran. Secondly, it's neither a nation nor a state. It is a collection of more or less feudal rulers or provincial leaders who historically have come together almost exclusively in resistance to foreign intervention, after which, again, they pursued their separatist tendencies. It became a part of the American security when the Taliban came into domination of Afghanistan. And the Taliban was a regime about as offensive to our conviction of fundamental human rights as existed anywhere in the world. That in itself would not have produced American intervention. It then became the base from which a series of attacks on American national security objectives was conducted in Africa, in Yemen, and finally in the United States. Therefore, to intervene in Afghanistan became an issue of national security. As fundamentalist jihad evolved, Afghanistan also became a place where the conflict between fundamentalist jihad and the other institutions in the Muslim world and the security of the whole world came to be tested. So now Afghanistan, as a center of terrorist or jihadist activities, is in a position where it threatens fundamentally the cohesion of Pakistan, where it threatens indirectly the security of India via where this fundamentalist Islam will go. The Muslim regions of Russia, some portions of China, and even Iran. So it is now a problem in which the future security of the world is fundamentally involved. Now we are now there exclusively, and that is a condition we ought to remedy. But we cannot remedy it in a month. In our domestic debate, the President stated as a candidate, and he has stated several times since, that he considers Afghanistan a war of necessity. And I agree with him. He has added troops to the deployment that existed, and that too I agree with. He now has before him the recommendation of a commander that was appointed by this administration, an ambassador appointed by this administration, and the commander of the Central Command. There is no political basis on which to refute, there is no strategic basis on which to refute this. And the political lesson that one would have to draw from that is that America does not want to pursue the strategy that it has announced as its goal. So I would argue that whether one wants more diplomatic flexibility or whether one believes that there has to be a certain military outcome, in either case, we should follow the basic recommendations that are now before us. When we have, we then need to adapt our strategy to one of the key lessons of the guerrilla war. One of the difficulties we had in Vietnam was the following, that we would control the countryside in the daytime and the Viet Cong controlled it at night. And so therefore, by attempting to achieve 100% security, 100% control, we achieved only about 50% or 60% of security. I believe then, and I believe even more now, that 100% security in 60% of the country is more important than 60% security in 100% of the country. So the first strategic objective we need to set ourselves is which part of the country containing the greatest degree of the population can we best protect. With that as a base, we then should attempt to move towards some international status for Afghanistan that applies in Afghanistan something that has not existed, and which is this. In Europe, when there were vacuums between various countries in the 19th century, they came up with the concept of neutralizing Belgium, for example, which meant that countries had the right to intervene to protect their interests when that neutralization was threatened. I would say we need a anti-terrorist agreement that agrees on the fundamental security objective and that separates this from a purely American problem. But for that we need time. And therefore, I believe that for us now to redefine our objective only because we cannot face the domestic consequences of following the strategic recommendations would be a big mistake.
That's a fascinating example of applying historical insights to contemporary problems. I can't think of anybody else in the world who would have drawn a parallel between Afghanistan and the neutralization of Belgium after the Napoleonic period. But of course, it raises a question about Iran, which is one of the stakeholders by virtue of geography in the fate of Afghanistan. In your early work, you wrote a great deal about revolutionary powers and the threat that they pose to international order. And it seems to me that Iran, since 1979, has perfectly fit the bill of a revolutionary power challenging international order. Now, I would like you to tell us a little bit about how you think we should proceed with this revolutionary power 30 years on after its revolution, and what you think we can achieve with diplomatic means to try to contain its obvious determination to become a nuclear-armed power. What do we do next?
When I mentioned Iran with relation to Afghanistan, that was not because I thought Iran was a benign country that had an interest in abstract stability in Afghanistan. I meant that Taliban, being a Sunni aberration and the most fundamentalist version of Sunni religion, inherently clashes with Shiite Iran, not because of abstract desirability, but because that is in the nature of things. And so at some point, Iran might participate in such a process, but not under present conditions. Now, Iran, in the mythology that now exists about Iran, the argument is that American administrations, in love with authoritarian regimes, for 30 years supported the Shah of Iran in order to have some form of government there that made it easy to deal with. But that wasn't the case. The case was that Iran was considered an essential building block of a strategy that kept the Soviet Union out of the Middle East, and that a strong and developing Iran was considered by a series of administrations of both parties, from Eisenhower through Kennedy, through Johnson and Nixon, administration of both parties, a building block of a strategy that contributed to the conduct of the Cold War and to the prevention of communist domination of the area. And one has to remember that too few people remember the influx of Soviet arms into the region and the concern with communist or radical parties at the time. I mention all of this because there's no reason why America needs to fear an Iran that governs itself and that believes in pursuing its historic national purposes. What creates a strategic problem for us and for the world is an Iran that seeks domination on the basis of its Shiite revolutionary fundamentalist impetus that supports terrorist organizations in Lebanon on the West Bank and all over the region. And therefore, it's an element in the instability of the region. Secondly, precisely because of the fear that Iran inspires, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, it is usually presented primarily as a threat to Israel. That's one aspect of it. But the major aspect of it is the impetus it will give to other countries in the region to protect themselves similarly by acquiring weapons of their own, either by buying them or by building up the infrastructure to get it. And thirdly, if you look at the record of diplomacy with respect to Iran, the major countries of the world for nearly a decade now have announced that a nuclear program, a weapons program in Iran is unacceptable. Now, the word unacceptable is not hard to comprehend. So if they accept it anyway, that will create a certain expectation of the meaning of the so-called world community. So for all of these reasons, it is important to be clear that this is a crucial dividing line. Now, I have favored in the previous administration and in this administration negotiations with Iran because I believe we owe it to the American public and to the world public to show that if there is a peaceful way out, we have attempted to take it. But I don't believe negotiations are a psychological or psychiatric problem. It is not a question of getting people into a conference room. It is a question of what outcome occurs in what period of time. And therefore, we have in our planning and in our bearing to convey that this is serious business and that there are consequences to the failure of the negotiations and that there is some sort of a time limit within which this has to take place. The key issue is, can Iran transform itself from a cause to a nation? If the latter, many things are possible. If not, the situation will become very problematical. And if they acquire nuclear weapons, we better start thinking of what it will be like to live in a world of multiple nuclear powers that do not have the technical capacity to safeguard their weapons the way the major powers in the Cold War were able to, and who may not understand the consequences of using nuclear weapons against population.
If it seems that within a very short space of time, Iran will become a nuclear-armed power, would you regard a preemptive military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities as a legitimate action for an American administration? And if not, would it be a legitimate unilateral action by an Israeli government, in your view?
I can understand that an Israeli government would feel that a state that has announced that it seeks the eradication of the Zionist state and that also acquires nuclear weapons is an intolerable security problem. So from the point of view of an Israeli national leader, I can understand that decision, and from that point of view, there's a certain legitimacy to it. From the American point of view, what we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do the day after such an attack? And Israel has to ask itself, what happens the day after such an attack, or the week after such an attack. And we will be faced with having to take positions both in international bodies and in bilateral relationships with our reaction to this. If we certify it and say it was legitimate, then we almost might participate in it. But then that's one type of situation. If we oppose it, then we will be in a situation in which is analogous in some respects to 1956, where many can argue we broke the back of the global foreign policy that Europeans were still conducting at that point. So whatever we have to say to Israel about an attack, we should not defer until after it has taken place. And we should recognize that this is not a way out of our difficulties, that in a certain way it will magnify the difficulties, even though I'd have understanding.
It's appropriate here at a dinner of the IRI to ask a question about an alternative strategy, namely to aim at regime change in Iran by non-military means. Did you feel in June that we might have done more, and that in particular the administration might have done more to encourage what seemed to be a revolutionary challenge to a stolen election? Or do you think President Obama did the right thing? I can't help asking that question because, as some of you may know, I like to pose what-if questions. And the what-if question that haunts me at the moment, and it's haunted me since June, is what if another man had been in the White House in June of this year? How would he have reacted to what seemed like a moment of regime change in Iran?
I believe that the events in June are the beginning of a gradual disintegration of this particular regime for the following reasons. The current regime has three pillars: the Ayatollahs, Iranian nationalism, and the democratic structure that produced the presidential election. Each of these pillars is now in question. The Ayatollahs are arguing among each other. And when you proclaim a universal Islamic republic based on a universal doctrine whose votaries are arguing among each other, you have greatly weakened the legitimacy of the religious pillar. The democratic element is in shambles since a large percentage of the population and an even larger percentage of the educated population believes that the election was fraudulently conducted, and the nationalism will probably lead to disputes as to what the correct nationalism is. So I believe, so this regime is structurally weaker than it was before. So the issue is how do we best deal with this? During the weeks in June, I thought that the conduct of the administration was essentially appropriate because we did, but I could understand that one did not want to give the Ayatollahs the excuse that this was an American enterprise. But in the period that is ahead, it is important that we emphasize the moral distinction we see in what we are facing, and that we do not slide into the position where we legitimize the Ahmadinejad government by an embrace of its conduct, or by somehow thinking or acting as if psychological reassurance of the people who have been making opposition to the United States and hatred of the United States their governing principle for 30 years should be the principal objective of our policy. Our policy should be to make clear what kind of Iran we can live with, but also to make clear the dangers of a world in which Iran has nuclear weapons, and not let that get confused in an endless negotiations on technical points.
When I was invited to participate in this evening, I was given an almost military program of events timed down to the smallest second. And I'm acutely and painfully aware that we're running out of time. However, I think it would be an egregious waste of an opportunity if I didn't ask Secretary Kissinger at least one more question. Stop me if you disagree. You've presented us with a world fraught with danger, a war in Afghanistan on a knife edge, a decision that could be taken on the basis of, as you put it, domestic politics over strategic judgment. Iran on the verge of becoming a nuclear power, and yet a weak regime. And I always think an important lesson of history is that it's weak regimes that take reckless strategic decisions, not strong ones. Let me introduce a third element into the complex three-dimensional chess of American grand strategy: China. Now, as was mentioned by Lawrence Eagleburger, perhaps your single greatest contribution to the history of the United States was a fundamental transformation in the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. With the benefit of historical hindsight, that looks like the great turning point of the second half of the 20th century. I've written recently about that relationship becoming almost a symbiotic one economically. I coined the phrase chimerica to describe what seemed like a fusion between the two economies. But I wonder whether that fusion is beginning to disintegrate, and whether we're entering a new phase in relations between China and America, in which a degree of strategic rivalry begins to take over from common economic interest, partly simply because we're no longer such an attractive customer for their goods, but partly because they are becoming more and more an economic equal to the United States. If anything poses a really major historic challenge to the United States today, it's the fact that within a relatively short space of time, some say as soon as the 2020s, China will be as large economically as the United States, something that never happened in the Cold War, though the Soviets dreamt of it. Tell us your vision of the future relationship between the United States and China as they become more and more equals, at least in the realm of economics. And what are the lessons of history? What do you do as the dominant power in the world when you see a real challenger coming up hard on your heels?
Gail, you serve breakfast here.
The last time I interviewed Henry, I think it lasted about 8 hours.
Let me make it's maybe the key question. I just want to make one point about the previous question. One often finds oneself in these debates describing a difficult situation and then being accused of pessimism. To describe that the situation in Afghanistan is complicated and that jihad is a major challenge to us does not mean that we cannot overcome it. The Cold War was difficult, and we overcame it. And if you had to play the hands of the jihadists, who are without an outside, no major country in the world supporting them, if I would say that our greatest danger is impatience. And if we develop the patience for a long-range strategy, we can overcome many of the problems that I described in answer to some of the questions about China. It is, without any question, a novel experience for us. The analogy that is often used is the rise of Germany after the unification of Germany, which led to World War I. But it led to World War I for two reasons. One, because Germany grew in power, but also because Germany conducted an extremely provocative foreign policy, and it took about 25 years of unbelievably short-sighted policy to generate a willingness in Britain to go into a world war. So when you have a rising power and the rising power challenges you militarily, then a conflict is very likely. What mitigates the prospects of this is that a war with modern weapons between major countries is unprecedentedly destructive. None of the leaders that started World War I, which was the seminal event here in the decline of Europe, none of those leaders would have started the war had they known what the world would look like 3 or 4 years later. So that is one restraining element in basic policy, entirely or largely on strategic consideration. Secondly, there's a whole series of issues that are unprecedented: climate, environment, energy, issues that can only be dealt with on a general basis. And third, I would say this: if it develops into a challenge, then we will have a kind of confrontational policy around the world, which would be extremely trying. But if it happened, we would have to do it. But I also believe it is in the interest of both countries to avoid it. If each side follows its DNA, there is a good possibility that it will develop the way you describe. The Chinese have a Middle Kingdom experience. We have a combination of concentration on the Western Hemisphere plus a certain missionary trend. If we can develop the statesmanship on both sides to overcome it, then it may be what you called, what did you call it exactly?
I call it chimerica.
Chimerica.
It's a pun on the word chimera, because I don't know that this relationship can last.
It may not. If you take historical experience, you'd say probably not. But we face a situation that is beyond historical experience and that is unique, and therefore it must be explored. It's the big challenge before the world. I can't predict how it will end. We will certainly attempt to look after our security, but it would be different from previous security challenges, and therefore we have, even while we look to our security, have to look at a structure that transcends what used to be the traditional pattern. And I say that as somebody who very often draws conclusions from historical experience. This is a case where we have to transcend historical experience.
Secretary Kissinger, that seems a very appropriate note on which to conclude our conversation. You are a worthy prize recipient. Thank you very much indeed. Shall we bear that?